Hello everyone, welcome back to Insomnia Protocol. Tonight, we have another terrifying horror story for you. Before we start, please subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and leave a comment below. Now, get ready, and let's dive in. If anyone asked me what the worst period of my life was, I wouldn't talk about a breakup or losing money. I would say it was the year I almost let my job consume me. I worked as a project manager for a logistics company in Toronto. At first, I genuinely enjoyed the job. The pace was fast, the pay was decent, and my coworkers were great. But after a round of layoffs, the workload of nearly 3 people ended up on my shoulders. A typical day started at 6 in the morning with me checking emails before I even got out of bed. By 7, I was driving through heavy traffic on the highway. Once I got to the office, I barely left my desk until evening. One meeting after another. The moment I finished a call with a client, Slack would light up with dozens more messages. Some days, I realized I hadn't eaten anything except a protein bar since 8 that morning. The worst part was that the work never stopped when I got home. My laptop was always sitting on the dining table. My phone constantly buzzed with emails from clients in different time zones. More than once, I opened my laptop close to midnight just to fix a small error in a report, only to look up and discover it was nearly 2 in the morning. I started forgetting very simple things. One time, I stood outside my apartment door for almost 5 minutes because I couldn't remember which pocket I had put my keys in. Another time, I poured coffee into a bowl of cereal instead of a mug and didn't realize it until I sat down. It sounds funny, but at the time it genuinely scared me. I was only 33 years old, yet my mind constantly felt as if it were covered by a layer of fog. My friends invited me fishing, camping, or simply out for a beer on the weekends many times. I always turned them down because I was too busy. After a few months, nobody invited me anymore. During a routine medical checkup, my doctor looked at my results and asked when the last time I had taken a vacation was. It took me nearly a full minute to remember. He simply closed the folder and spoke in a calm voice. Your body can still handle it, but your mind can't. If you don't take some time to rest, sooner or later it's going to force you to stop. That sentence stayed in my head for days. That evening, I opened Google Maps and searched through all kinds of resorts, cabins, and homestays. Some were fully booked, others were crowded with tourists, and some offered all sorts of activities that I had no interest in joining. What I needed wasn't a luxury vacation. I just wanted to go somewhere my phone wouldn't ring, where nobody knew where I was, and nobody asked whether the report was finished yet. That's when I suddenly remembered Uncle Mark. He was my mother's older brother and lived alone in a log cabin deep in the mountains of northern Canada. When I was 12 years old, my parents took me there once during the summer. I could barely remember what the cabin looked like. I only remembered the mirror, like lake, the scent of pine after the rain, and a sky filled with stars that you could never see in the city. My mother had passed away many years earlier, and after that I gradually lost touch with him. I searched through an old drawer in my apartment and found my mother's address book. Uncle Mark's phone number was still written in blue ink in the corner of one of the pages. I called, thinking there was a good chance the number had been disconnected years ago. After a few rings, a man's voice answered on the other end of the line. Deep, slow, and carrying the weight of age. Hello. I was silent for a few seconds before finally speaking. Uncle Mark. It's me. He recognized me almost immediately. After a few minutes of catching up, I explained that I was simply looking for a quiet place to rest for a few weeks. He chuckled softly. If you truly want to get away from the city, I know exactly the place. Then he added, the cabin is still there. No neighbors, no tourists, and barely any cell service. If you don't mind the silence, come on up. 3 days later, I packed a few changes of clothes, some personal belongings, and an old fishing rod into the trunk of my car, and set out on the longest drive I had taken in years. The farther north I drove, the more the skyscrapers gave way to endless forests of pine trees. Billboards disappeared. Gas stations became fewer and farther between. My phone signal flickered on and off until only a single bar remained. The strange thing was, I didn't feel worried at all. For the first time in many months, I felt like I was truly leaving behind the life that had worn me down to the point of exhaustion. The road eventually narrowed into a gravel path that cut through dense pine trees on both sides. My tires crunched over loose stones for almost 20 minutes before I finally saw smoke rising in the distance. Then the cabin appeared. It looked almost exactly the way I remembered it, only older. The logs had darkened with age. The porch leaned slightly to one side. A stack of chopped firewood sat neatly beside the house. There was a small lake about 100 yards away. The water was perfectly still. Uncle Mark was standing outside before I even parked the car. He looked older than I expected. His hair was almost completely gray now, but his face carried the same calm expression I remembered from childhood. He smiled and gave me a hug. "Long drive?" he asked. "Longer than I remembered. That is usually how life works." He helped me carry my bags inside. The cabin was simple. One living room, a kitchen, 2 bedrooms, a wood stove, old furniture that had clearly been repaired many times over the years. There was no television, no internet router, no modern decorations. Honestly, it felt incredible. My phone immediately dropped to no signal. I laughed when I saw it. Uncle Mark noticed. "Good," he said. "You came here to disappear for a while." He made us coffee while I sat near the window. The silence was almost overwhelming at first. No cars. No sirens. No voices, just wind moving through trees. "How long have you been living here?" I asked. 30 years now." "By yourself?" "Mostly." I noticed the way he answered that, mostly. But I did not ask about it. We spent the rest of the afternoon talking about family members I had not seen in years. The conversation was easy, comfortable, like reconnecting with someone you trusted without remembering why. As the sun slowly moved lower, Uncle Mark suddenly stood up. "Before it gets dark, there are a few things you need to know." I assumed he meant practical things, maybe bears or weather conditions. Instead, he walked over to the refrigerator and handed me a piece of paper. 6 sentences were written on it in blue ink. I immediately recognized his handwriting. "What is this?" I asked. "House rules." I smiled. "Seriously, very seriously." I read them. "Always leave the back door open. Never lock it. Never answer if someone calls your name after midnight. Do not look toward a crying child in the woods. Do not leave the house after sunset. Never answer 3 knocks at the door. Close all windows before dark." I looked back up at him. "Is this a joke?" He shook his head. "No." "Who wrote these?" I did. "Why?" He sat down and stirred his coffee. "Because every person who stays here needs to follow them." I almost laughed again, but something stopped me. He did not look amused. He looked serious, very serious. "Uncle Mark, are these because of animals? Some of them are for safety, and the others," he paused. "Just trust me." I waited for him to explain further. He never did. Instead, he changed the subject. We ate dinner and talked about fishing spots around the lake. By 10 that night, I was exhausted. I went to bed almost immediately. The first night was peaceful. I slept deeper than I had in years. No alarms. No email notifications. No buzzing phone. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. The air smelled clean. I made coffee and sat outside watching fog drift across the lake. For the first time in a long time, my brain felt quiet. The next few days followed a simple routine. Wake up, eat breakfast, walk around the lake, read a book, help Uncle Mark with chores, cook dinner, sleep. Honestly, it was exactly what I needed. The rules stayed in the back of my mind, but I treated them as eccentric habits from an old man living alone for decades. People develop strange routines. That was my explanation. On the 4th day, something small happened. I was outside around noon repairing a loose board on the porch. I noticed the back door standing open. Wide open. It was strange because there was no wind. I walked over and pushed it closed. About an hour later, Uncle Mark saw it. His expression changed immediately. He reopened it without saying anything. "Sorry," I said. "I thought you forgot." He looked at me for a moment. "Never close that door." "Why?" "Because it stays open." "That is not really an explanation," he nodded. "I know." Then he walked away. That was it. No explanation. That night, I thought about it more than I should have. The next day was normal again. Then another day passed. On the seventh night, I heard something strange. I woke up around 1 in the morning. Someone was outside. I could hear footsteps moving through gravel. Slow footsteps. Crunch, crunch, crunch. I sat up in bed. The footsteps stopped outside my window. Then I heard a voice, my own name, perfectly clear. Daniel. I froze. It was a woman's voice, soft and familiar somehow. Daniel. My entire body became tense. Then I remembered the rule. If someone calls your name after midnight, do not answer. Do not open the door. I almost ignored it. Almost. Then the voice changed. Daniel, I am hurt. It sounded closer now. Please help me. Every normal instinct told me to get up, but something felt wrong. The words sounded human. The emotion did not. It was too perfect somehow, like someone reading from a script. Then it spoke again. Please. I am lost. I stayed completely still. The room felt colder. Several minutes passed. Then the footsteps slowly moved away. The next morning, I told Uncle Mark everything. He simply nodded. You did the right thing. Who was it? Nobody you want to meet. Was it a person? No. His answer came immediately. Too immediately. Then what was it? He looked toward the forest. I do not know. That answer unsettled me more than anything else. Later that day, we went fishing. Everything seemed normal again. I almost convinced myself I had imagined the whole thing. Then around sunset, we heard it. A child crying somewhere deep in the trees. It sounded far away, maybe 200 yards, maybe less. I stood up immediately. Did someone bring their kid out here? Uncle Mark grabbed my arm so hard it surprised me. Do not look. His voice was sharp, inside. Now. We walked quickly back to the cabin. The crying continued. It sounded closer every few seconds. But there were no footsteps, no branches breaking. Just crying. The saddest sound I had ever heard. Like a child completely alone. I almost turned my head. Uncle Mark squeezed my arm harder. Do not. We got inside. He shut the front door. Then we sat in silence. The crying continued for another 10 minutes. Then it suddenly stopped. Not gradually, instantly. As if someone had pressed a button. The silence afterward was somehow worse. That night, neither of us said much. I was beginning to realize something. The rules were not habits. They were survival instructions. And whatever lived out there had been here for a very long time. Then, right before bed, Uncle Mark said something that made my stomach drop. Tomorrow, I have to drive into town for supplies. How long? Several hours. You are leaving me here alone. He nodded. You will be fine. Then he looked directly at me. As long as you remember the rules. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual, because I was already thinking about being alone in the cabin. Uncle Mark was making breakfast when I walked into the kitchen. He had eggs, toast, and coffee waiting on the table. Everything looked normal, but there was a strange tension in the air. He was quieter than usual. Every few minutes, he glanced toward the windows as if checking the position of the sun. Around 8 in the morning, he loaded empty containers into the back of his truck. I followed him outside. The weather was beautiful. The sky was clear, and the lake reflected every tree around it. If somebody took a photograph of that place, nobody would ever imagine anything was wrong there. Before leaving, Uncle Mark handed me a folded piece of paper. It was identical to the one on the refrigerator. The 6 rules were written again in blue ink. He told me to keep it in my pocket all day. I smiled nervously and slipped it into my jacket. Then he stared at me for a few seconds. His expression was more serious than I had ever seen before. He said that most people got into trouble because they stopped taking simple things seriously. I asked him again what exactly lived in those woods. He simply shook his head. Then he drove away. The sound of the truck slowly disappeared into the distance until there was nothing left but silence. Real silence. The kind you never experience in a city. At first, it was peaceful. I cleaned the kitchen. I read a book for a while. I sat outside drinking coffee. Around noon, I decided to walk around the lake. Uncle Mark had never forbidden me from going outside during the day. In fact, we had done it together several times. The lake was beautiful. The air smelled like pine and cold water. I found myself breathing deeper without realizing it. My shoulders felt relaxed for the first time in years. Then I noticed something odd. There were footprints in the mud near the edge of the lake. Bare footprints. Human footprints. I crouched down to examine them. They were fresh. They looked normal at first. Then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The prints only went toward the water. There were no footprints coming back. I looked across the lake. Nothing. Just trees. I told myself an animal had disturbed the ground somehow. That explanation barely made sense, but I accepted it anyway. That was still easier than thinking about other possibilities. I returned to the cabin around 3 in the afternoon. The rest of the day passed quietly. I cooked myself a simple dinner and washed the dishes immediately afterward. Then I checked every window because sunset was approaching. One by one, I closed them all. I remembered the 6th rule. By the time darkness arrived, I was sitting in the living room reading a book under a lamp. Around 9:30, something hit the roof. A loud thump. I froze for a second. Then another one. Thump. I walked toward the window but stopped myself. It could have been a branch, a pine cone, an animal. The sounds continued for several minutes before stopping entirely. I tried to focus on my book again. Around 10:30, I decided to go to bed. I was halfway down the hallway when I realized something. The back door was no longer open. I stared at it. It was shut completely. I was positive it had been open all day. My heart began beating faster. I slowly walked toward it. I had not touched it. Nobody should have touched it. I grabbed the handle and opened it again. Cold air drifted inside. Then I heard something move in the darkness behind the cabin. Not running. Not walking. More like dragging itself through leaves. Slowly. I immediately stepped back inside and left the door open exactly as instructed. Then I locked my bedroom door, even though that probably would not help if something truly wanted to come inside. I slept for maybe 2 hours before a sound woke me up. Knock. Knock. 3 knocks, perfectly spaced apart. My eyes opened instantly. Every hair on my arm stood up. I stayed completely still. Another 10 seconds passed. Then I heard nothing. Absolute silence. I remembered the 5th rule. Never answer 3 knocks. Never look outside. My curiosity fought against my fear. For several seconds, I almost stood up. I almost walked toward the living room. Then I remembered something from my old life. Every bad decision at work started with the same thought. It will only take a second. I stayed in bed. 5 minutes passed. Then I heard footsteps circling the cabin. Slow footsteps. They moved from one side of the house to the other. Then they stopped beneath my window. I held my breath. Somebody was standing there. I could feel it. Then a voice spoke. Daniel. It was my mother's voice. My entire body went cold. She had been dead for years. Daniel opened the window. I need to talk to you. I squeezed my eyes shut. The voice was perfect. Every detail was identical. Her tone. Her rhythm. Even the slight raspiness she had during her later years. Tears immediately filled my eyes, because hearing her again affected me more than I expected. Then I remembered what Uncle Mark said. Nobody you want to meet. The voice spoke again. Daniel, why are you ignoring me? Open the window. I know you are there. My breathing became shaky. Then the voice changed. The warmth disappeared. The words sounded flatter, more mechanical somehow. Daniel, open the window. Then complete silence. I stayed awake until sunrise. I never moved from my bed. The moment daylight filled the room, I got up and checked outside. There were no footprints. Nothing. No evidence anybody had been there. Around 9 in the morning, Uncle Mark finally returned. I told him everything. Every detail. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he sat quietly for a while. Then he asked me a question that caught me off guard. He asked if my mother used to sing while cooking dinner. I stared at him. She did. It was one of my strongest memories of her. He nodded slowly. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. Whatever was out there did not read minds. It learned people. It listened. It watched. It collected pieces of them over time. I asked him how long it had been doing that. He looked toward the forest again, longer than any person alive could remember. Then he stood up and grabbed his coat. I asked where he was going. He said we needed more firewood before sunset. I followed him outside. The entire forest suddenly felt different. It no longer looked peaceful. Every tree seemed like a place where something could be standing without being seen. As we walked, Uncle Mark spoke quietly. He said there was one thing he had not told me yet, because he hoped I would never have to know. My stomach immediately tightened. Then he said, the thing outside was becoming more active than usual. It only did that when it believed somebody was preparing to leave the cabin permanently, and for reasons he did not understand. It had become very interested in me. We carried firewood back to the cabin in silence. I kept looking over my shoulder every few minutes. Nothing was there. At least, nothing I could see. The strange thing was that fear had changed the entire environment around me. The same trees that looked beautiful a few days ago now felt oppressive. The spaces between them seemed deeper somehow, darker, like they stretched farther than they should. We stacked the wood beside the porch. Then Uncle Mark sat down in an old chair and motioned for me to sit across from him. The sky was still bright. There were several hours before sunset. He took a deep breath before speaking. He said he needed to tell me something he should have explained years ago. Apparently my mother used to come to this cabin often after my grandfather died. She spent several summers there with Uncle Mark. One day she encountered the same thing that now surrounded the cabin. She never spoke about it publicly because she thought people would think she had lost her mind. Instead, she simply respected the rules and left. That was all. She never returned. I asked him why he stayed if he knew something dangerous lived there. He smiled sadly. He said he asked himself that question every year. Then he pointed toward the back door. He said that as long as the rules were followed, people remained safe. The problem was that eventually everyone became curious. Everyone became confident. Everyone eventually believed they understood the situation. And that was when mistakes happened. I asked if anyone had ever died there. He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once. 20 years ago, a man from a nearby town came to hunt in the area. He ignored every warning. He disappeared after 3 nights. Search teams found his truck but never found him. Since then, nobody from town willingly came near the lake. I asked why there were no signs or fences. Uncle Mark said people simply stayed away because older generations passed down the warnings. The younger generations thought it was superstition and never bothered visiting. It was an isolated place, easy to avoid. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. We played cards while rain slowly moved in. The sound of droplets hitting the roof was relaxing. For a while, I almost forgot everything. Then sunset arrived. Uncle Mark immediately stood up and checked every window. I helped him. We moved from room to room. Every window was locked and secured. Then he paused in the hallway. His face changed instantly. One window was open. My heart dropped. It was a small window in the spare bedroom. I was certain we had closed it earlier. The sun was already below the horizon. The forest outside had become dark blue. Uncle Mark grabbed my arm before I could approach it. He shook his head. "We leave it." I stared at him. "But it is open," he repeated himself. "We leave it until morning." I felt anxiety spreading through my chest. Every instinct told me to close it. It was only a few steps away. It would take 3 seconds. But the 6th rule came back to me. If you discover an open window after dark, do not check it. Wait until morning. So we waited. We sat in the living room. Nobody spoke for almost an hour. Then I noticed something. The room felt colder. Not freezing. Just colder than it should have been. The temperature slowly kept dropping. Then we heard breathing. Very soft breathing. Coming from the hallway. I immediately turned my head. Uncle Mark grabbed my wrist. "Do not look directly at the hallway." I obeyed him. We both stared at the fireplace instead. The breathing continued slow, deep. Then it stopped. A minute later, I heard footsteps. They moved toward the spare bedroom, then toward the kitchen, then toward the back door. Then everything went silent again. I could hear my own heartbeat. The clock on the wall suddenly sounded much louder than usual. Tick, tick, tick. Around 11. Things felt normal again. Then midnight arrived. We heard somebody running outside. Not walking. Running. Fast footsteps circled the cabin. Gravel scattered beneath them. Then suddenly everything stopped outside the front door. 3 knocks. Caught, caught, caught. We remained perfectly still. Then another voice spoke. It was Uncle Mark's voice. The exact same voice. "Open the door, Daniel." I forgot my jacket outside. My blood turned to ice. Uncle Mark was sitting right beside me. He did not react. The voice continued. "Open the door. Hurry. I am cold." Then another voice spoke. My own voice. It sounded exactly like me. "Open the door, Uncle Mark. Everything is fine. I have to go outside." I felt nausea immediately. Hearing your own voice from somewhere else is difficult to describe. It sounds wrong in ways your brain cannot explain. Like hearing a recording that somehow knows things it should not know. The voices alternated for almost 15 minutes. Then they stopped. We sat awake until 2 in the morning. Then another sound appeared. Crying. A child crying in the woods again. This time it sounded closer than before. Much closer. Maybe 30 feet away. It was impossible not to hear. I covered my ears. It did not help. The crying slowly moved around the cabin. Then it stopped beside my window. Complete silence followed. Then a tiny voice said something that made my entire body freeze. It said my mother's name. Not my name, her name. Then it whispered something else. It said she should have stayed. Uncle Mark suddenly stood up. It was the first time I had ever seen him look afraid. Real fear. He quietly told me to go to my room and lock the door. I asked him what was happening. He said it was changing. He said it was learning faster than before. I did exactly as he said. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling for hours. Sleep was impossible. Around 4 in the morning I heard movement outside my room. Soft footsteps. Then they stopped directly outside my door. A hand slowly scraped along the wood. I could hear fingernails dragging against it. Then a voice whispered, "Daniel, you forgot one rule." My heart stopped for a moment. I sat up immediately. What rule? I went through every rule in my head. The back door was open. I never answered anybody. I never looked toward the child. I never went outside. I never answered the knocks. Every window except one had been closed before dark. Then the voice laughed softly. It was my own laugh. Then it walked away. Morning eventually arrived. I opened my door and found scratches all over the outside. Long scratches, like somebody had dragged their fingers across the wood for several minutes. Uncle Mark was already awake. He looked exhausted. He had dark circles under his eyes. Then he told me something that completely changed everything. There was another rule, one he never wrote down because nobody had ever needed it before. If the thing ever began speaking with your own voice, it meant it had chosen you. And once that happened, leaving the cabin would no longer be enough to escape it. I stared at Uncle Mark for several seconds, because I genuinely thought I had misunderstood him. My brain was desperately trying to force logic back into the situation. There had to be another explanation. Stress, isolation, sleep deprivation. Maybe the silence out here was affecting me. Maybe weeks of burnout before arriving had damaged my ability to think clearly. But every time I looked at the scratches on my bedroom door, those explanations fell apart. They were real. I could touch them. Uncle Mark sat down at the kitchen table and poured himself coffee. His hands trembled slightly. It was the first sign that he was not as calm as he pretended to be. I sat across from him. "What does chosen mean?" I asked. He took a long breath before answering. He said that over the years, he had noticed a pattern. The thing outside did not behave the same way toward everyone. Most visitors heard voices for a few nights and then left without further problems. But every once in a while, it focused on a specific person. Once that happened, the voices became more personal, more accurate, more aggressive. It wanted something. He admitted he still did not know what that something was. I asked if my mother had been chosen too. He slowly nodded. My stomach immediately tightened. He told me she left before things got worse, but she never truly escaped it. I stared at him. "What does that mean?" He said my mother used to wake up in the middle of the night for years afterward. She would walk around her house checking every window. Sometimes she claimed she heard somebody calling her name from outside, even in the middle of Toronto, even in crowded neighborhoods. Then eventually it stopped. She never spoke about it again. I asked why she never told me. He smiled sadly. "Because she wanted you to have a normal life." The rest of the morning passed quietly. We both pretended everything was normal. We cleaned the cabin. We split firewood. We cooked lunch. But the atmosphere had changed. There was no longer any peace in my thoughts. Every time I looked toward the trees, I felt something looking back. Around 3 in the afternoon, I noticed movement near the lake. Somebody was standing there. My heart immediately jumped. I squinted my eyes. The figure looked exactly like me. Same height, same jacket, same posture. It was standing perfectly still beside the water. Then it slowly walked into the forest. I froze. Uncle Mark noticed my face. He immediately followed my gaze. But by then, nothing was there. He sighed. "It is getting closer." That was all he said. That evening, he brought an old metal box onto the kitchen table. Inside were dozens of notebooks. Some looked 40 years old. Others looked recent. Every notebook belonged to someone who had stayed at the cabin. I opened one. It was written by a woman from Calgary. She described hearing her dead brother call her name at night. Another notebook belonged to a man from Ottawa. He described finding wet footprints inside the cabin every morning. Another belonged to a teacher from Montreal. Her entries stopped suddenly after 10 days. I looked up at Uncle Mark. What happened to her? He looked away. Nobody knows. The room became very quiet after that. Then I opened another notebook. It belonged to my mother. My hands immediately started shaking. The handwriting was unmistakably hers. I began reading. The first entries were normal. She wrote about fishing, about sunsets, about relaxing. Then things slowly changed. One sentence made my skin crawl. It knows memories that I have never spoken aloud. Another sentence appeared several pages later. It is trying to make me leave the house after dark. Then another. I saw myself standing outside my own window. I suddenly stopped reading. My chest felt tight. Uncle Mark quietly told me to continue. Near the end, my mother had written something else. If it chooses Daniel one day, never let him stay alone. My entire body went cold. I looked at Uncle Mark immediately. Why would she write that? He looked just as unsettled. I do not know. That sentence was never there before. I stared at him. What do you mean? He walked over and opened the notebook himself. Then he pointed to the page. The ink was different, fresher. It could not have been more than a few days old. We both stood there in silence. Nobody had touched that notebook since I arrived. That was impossible. We spent the rest of the evening checking every lock and every window. We were both nervous now. Sunset came quickly. Once darkness settled over the forest, the cabin felt isolated in a way I had never experienced before. The darkness out there did not feel empty anymore. It felt occupied. Around 10, we sat near the fireplace. Nobody was talking much. Then we heard something unusual. Laughter. A group of people laughing outside. I stood up immediately. That made no sense. There should not have been anybody for miles. The laughter sounded friendly, casual, like people sitting around a campfire. Then I heard my own voice mixed among them. Then my mother's voice. Then Uncle Mark's voice. They were all laughing together. The sound slowly circled the cabin. Then it stopped. Around midnight, another sound replaced it. A truck engine. I froze immediately. It sounded exactly like Uncle Mark's truck. I ran toward the front door before stopping myself. The engine shut off outside. Then somebody walked onto the porch. Heavy footsteps. Then a voice spoke. It was Uncle Mark again. Daniel, open the door. I forgot my keys. My entire body stiffened. Uncle Mark was sitting beside me. Neither of us moved. The voice continued. Open the door. I need help carrying supplies. Then silence. Then another voice appeared. This time it was mine. Open the door, Uncle Mark. We should let him in. The footsteps remained there for almost 20 minutes. Then they slowly walked away. Around 1 a.m, I noticed something terrifying. The back door was closed again. I stared at it in disbelief. I knew we had left it open. I walked toward it. Uncle Mark immediately stood up. Do not touch it. We both stared at the door. Then it slowly opened by itself. Just a few inches. Cold air drifted inside. Then something whispered from the darkness behind it. Thank you. My entire body froze. Uncle Mark quietly closed his eyes. Then he said something that made my fear multiply instantly. It had never spoken through the back door before. That meant one thing. The rules were beginning to fail. And if the rules stopped working, we would have no idea what happened next. I did not sleep at all that night. Neither did Uncle Mark. We stayed in the living room until sunrise with a lamp on and the fireplace burning. The strange thing was that after the whisper came through the back door, nothing else happened. No footsteps. No voices. No crying child. Just silence. Somehow that was worse. It felt deliberate. Like something was testing us and becoming more confident every day. When the first sunlight finally entered the cabin, both of us looked exhausted. Uncle Mark immediately walked to the back door and stared outside for almost a minute. Then he slowly closed it for the first time since I arrived. My heart immediately skipped a beat. I thought that door had to stay open all the time. I reminded him about the first rule. He nodded. Then he reopened it a few seconds later. He was testing something. He sat back down and rubbed his face. Then he said something that I was not prepared to hear. He thought the rules were not protections anymore. He thought they were becoming invitations. I stared at him. What does that mean? He explained that every rule existed because somebody survived long enough to discover it. But what if the thing had adapted over time? What if it was learning how humans responded? Every year, every visitor, every mistake, decades of observation. Suddenly a horrible idea entered my mind. It was learning because people kept feeding it information. Every visitor became a teacher. Every fear became a lesson. Uncle Mark quietly agreed. That was exactly what he feared. The entire day felt different after that conversation. We no longer treated the cabin like a safe place. We treated it like a temporary shelter inside enemy territory. Around noon, we drove into town. It was my first time leaving the property since arriving. The town was tiny, maybe 200 people at most. There was a grocery store, a diner, and a gas station. Everything looked completely normal. For a moment, I felt relief. Real life still existed. People were laughing. A couple was walking their dog. Somebody was washing a pickup truck. I almost felt embarrassed about how afraid I had become. Then something happened. We entered the diner for lunch. An older woman behind the counter froze when she saw me. She stared for several seconds. Then she looked at Uncle Mark. Her face immediately became pale. She quietly walked over and asked how long I had been staying at the cabin. I told her about a week. She looked disturbed. Then she asked if I had started hearing my own voice yet. Every muscle in my body tensed. Uncle Mark answered for me. The woman sighed heavily. Then she said something I would never forget. Nobody stays there too long anymore. The last person who was chosen never truly came back. I asked her what she meant. She pointed toward a man sitting alone near the window. He looked to be around 60 years old. He was staring at a cup of coffee without blinking. She explained that 20 years earlier, he had stayed at the cabin for 2 weeks. He survived. He left. But something changed. He stopped talking to people. He barely slept. Every night he still sat near his back door, waiting for somebody to call his name. We approached him. He slowly looked up at me. Then his expression changed immediately. His eyes widened with fear. He whispered a sentence that made my blood run cold. "It remembers your mother." Then he stood up and walked away without another word. We returned to the cabin in complete silence. The forest looked darker somehow, even though it was still afternoon. Every tree seemed more crowded than before, as if something stood behind each one. We unloaded supplies quickly. Then Uncle Mark carried another box into the cabin. Inside were old photographs. He handed me one. It was my mother standing near the lake when she was around my age. I smiled for a second before noticing something behind her. There was a figure between 2 trees, very far away, easy to miss. It looked like a person, but something was wrong with its proportions. Its arms were too long. Uncle Mark handed me another photograph taken 10 years later. The same figure was there. Different location, same distance. Then another photograph, same figure. My chest tightened. It had been there the entire time. Decades. Watching. Waiting. That evening we prepared earlier than usual. Every window was closed before sunset. The fireplace was ready. Extra lanterns sat on the table. Then darkness arrived. Around 9:30, I heard water dripping. Drip, drip. The sound came from the kitchen. I walked over. Water was dripping from the ceiling, but there was no rain outside. I placed a bowl underneath it. Then I noticed something strange. It was not water. It was lake water. I could smell it immediately. Cold and earthy. Drip, drip. The dripping continued for almost an hour before stopping. Around 11, we heard breathing again in the hallway. This time it was heavier, much heavier. Then footsteps appeared. They slowly moved around the cabin. Then they stopped outside my bedroom. I remained still. Then something tapped on the wall beside my head. 1 tap, 2 taps, 3 taps, then silence. Midnight arrived. The entire cabin suddenly shook once. Not violently, just enough to rattle dishes. Then I heard something impossible. Somebody was inside my bedroom. I could hear breathing behind me. My entire body froze. I was facing the wall. I did not turn around. I could feel a presence standing beside my bed. Then it spoke in my voice. "Daniel, do not turn around." Every hair on my body stood up. The voice sounded exactly like me. Then it laughed softly. The mattress beside me slowly sank down, as if somebody had sat on it. I squeezed my eyes shut. Then another voice appeared. My mother's voice. "Daniel, I am sorry." Then a third voice. Uncle Mark's voice. "It is already inside." I felt my heartbeat becoming uncontrollable. Then suddenly everything disappeared. The pressure on the bed vanished. The breathing stopped. Morning eventually arrived. We barely survived another night. But Uncle Mark looked terrified in a way I had never seen before. He sat at the table for a long time before finally speaking. Then he told me something that changed everything again. Nobody had ever reached this stage before and remained alive for more than 3 nights afterward. We were entering territory that no notebook had ever recorded. And somewhere out in those woods, whatever had been watching this family for decades was no longer waiting outside the cabin anymore. It was trying to learn how to come inside permanently. That morning felt wrong from the moment I opened my eyes. Nothing had happened yet, but something was different. The cabin no longer felt like a cabin. It felt occupied. Not by another person, but by a presence that had become comfortable. Almost familiar. That was the worst part. Fear was turning into routine. I hated that. A week earlier, hearing my dead mother's voice would have shattered me. Now my first thought every morning was whether we had survived the night. Uncle Mark was already awake. He sat near the fireplace holding one of the old notebooks. He looked exhausted, older somehow. I poured coffee and sat across from him. He pushed the notebook toward me. Inside was a page I had never seen before. It was blank yesterday. Now there was writing on it. My writing. My exact handwriting. My stomach immediately dropped. The sentence was simple. "You are already taking pieces of it home with you." I stared at the page for several seconds. Then I looked at my hands. I had not written anything. I was certain of that. Uncle Mark nodded slowly. He believed me. Apparently this had happened before, but never this early. He said the thing was no longer trying to scare me. It was trying to convince me that parts of reality could no longer be trusted. That was much more dangerous. We spent most of the day outside because staying indoors was becoming unbearable. We repaired part of the dock near the lake. We chopped wood. We avoided discussing what happened overnight. But both of us kept looking toward the forest every few minutes. Around noon, something odd happened. There were birds everywhere. Then suddenly every single one of them stopped singing at exactly the same time. Complete silence covered the entire forest. I stood there holding an axe. Uncle Mark immediately froze too. We both listened. Nothing. No wind. No insects. No water moving. Just silence. Then I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around. Nobody was there. Then another set of footsteps came from my left, then my right. They surrounded us for almost 30 seconds. Then they vanished. The birds immediately resumed singing as if nothing had happened. Uncle Mark looked deeply unsettled. He said it had never done that before. Then he said something else. It was no longer waiting for nighttime. That terrified me more than anything else so far. Nighttime at least gave us rules. Daylight was supposed to be safe. We returned to the cabin earlier than usual. Around 3 in the afternoon, I noticed something sitting on the kitchen table. My car keys. I stared at them. They should have been inside my jacket pocket. I walked over and picked them up. Attached to them was a small note. There was no handwriting. Just one sentence typed on an old typewriter. Go home before it is too late. I immediately looked at Uncle Mark. He swore he had never seen it before. We searched the entire cabin. Nothing else was out of place. But something had entered while we were outside. Or maybe it had always been inside. That thought was worse. Then another question entered my mind. Why was it telling me to leave now? Until this point, everything it did had tried to lure me into danger. Why warn me to escape? Uncle Mark became very quiet. Then he said something unexpected. Maybe it was not a warning. Maybe it was a trick. Maybe it wanted me to leave, because that was how it escaped the cabin. My blood ran cold immediately. Nobody had ever said that possibility out loud before. We had always assumed leaving meant safety. But what if that was wrong? What if the cabin itself was the reason it had remained isolated for decades? Suddenly, every memory from the past week felt different. The rules, the back door, the voices. Maybe they were not protecting us from something outside. Maybe they were keeping something contained. I felt dizzy. My entire understanding of the situation shifted. Uncle Mark looked disturbed too. He admitted he had never considered that possibility until now. Around sunset, we prepared carefully again. Every window was closed. The back door remained open. We ate dinner in silence. Then darkness arrived. At 9, we heard movement beneath the cabin. Not footsteps. Crawling. Something was moving underneath the floorboards. Slowly. Deliberately. We both sat completely still. The crawling moved from one end of the cabin to the other. Then it stopped beneath my chair. 3 slow knocks came from under the floor. Then silence. Around 10, the temperature dropped rapidly. My breath became visible. The fireplace was burning normally, but the room kept getting colder. Then I noticed something that made my stomach twist. There was another chair in the room. An extra chair. I stared at it. We only had 4 chairs. Now there were 5. I looked at Uncle Mark. He noticed it too. Neither of us moved. We simply stared at it. Then very slowly, the chair turned toward us by itself. The sound of wood scraping against the floor seemed incredibly loud. Then it stopped, facing directly toward me. My heartbeat accelerated immediately. We did not touch it. We did not speak. We simply waited. Midnight arrived. Then something happened that I still struggle to explain. Every clock in the cabin stopped at exactly the same second. The ticking vanished instantly. Then complete silence covered the house. A few seconds later, a voice spoke from every room simultaneously. "Daniel, come outside." My entire body froze. The voice came from the kitchen, the hallway, my bedroom, and the bathroom all at once. Then another voice joined it, my mother's voice. Then another, my own voice. Then dozens more voices appeared. People I did not know. Men, women, children. They all repeated the same sentence. "Come outside." The entire cabin vibrated with whispers. Then suddenly they all stopped. Absolute silence returned. Then something tapped on the window beside me. One tap, then another, then another. I refused to look. Uncle Mark refused to. Then the tapping moved to another window, then another, then another. Every window in the cabin was being tapped at the same time. Slowly, methodically. Then all the tapping stopped. I thought it was over. Then I heard a sound from behind me. Breathing. Somebody was standing inside the living room with us. I could feel it. I slowly looked toward Uncle Mark. His face had become completely pale. He was staring at something over my shoulder. He whispered 4 words that I will never forget. "Do not turn around." My entire body locked in place. Then I heard it inhale deeply, very deeply, like it was smelling the air around me. Then it whispered directly beside my ear, "You are beginning to remember." Then the breathing vanished. Morning finally came hours later. Neither of us slept. Neither of us moved from our chairs. Then Uncle Mark said something that changed everything again. He said my mother had not come to the cabin by accident all those years ago. She had been called there too. And according to one final notebook, hidden beneath the floorboards, every member of our family had eventually been called to that same cabin. For over 100 years, I thought I was too exhausted to feel surprised anymore. But hearing that my family had been connected to this place for over a century completely shattered whatever stability I had left. Uncle Mark brought out another notebook. It was the oldest one I had seen. The pages were yellow and brittle. The first entry was dated 1919. It belonged to my great-grandfather. He wrote that he had been drawn to the lake after repeatedly dreaming about it. He had never seen the place before, yet somehow he knew exactly where to go. Several generations later, the same thing happened again and again. Different cities, different lives, different circumstances. Yet eventually somebody from our family always ended up here. I sat there trying to process it. My rational side was fighting desperately to reject everything. But after everything I had experienced, logic was becoming harder to hold on to. I asked Uncle Mark why nobody ever destroyed the cabin. Why not burn it down? Why not leave forever? He shook his head immediately. Apparently people had tried. He showed me photographs from decades ago. In one image, the cabin was completely gone, burned to the ground. Then another photograph, taken 2 years later, showed the cabin standing exactly where it had always been. Identical. Even the damaged porch was there. Another person had attempted to demolish it with heavy equipment. The machines stopped working. He left and never returned. Eventually everyone stopped trying. Instead, they maintained it. That answer should have terrified me. Oddly enough, it just made me tired. Deeply tired. I realized fear could only stretch so far before your mind simply became numb. The entire day passed with an uncomfortable feeling hanging over us. I noticed Uncle Mark watching me constantly now. At first I thought he was worried about my safety. Then I realized he was watching for something else. Changes. Around noon, I walked into the bathroom to wash my face. I looked up at the mirror and immediately froze. My reflection was delayed by a fraction of a second. I moved my hand. My reflection followed just a little too late. I stood there staring at myself. Then my reflection smiled. I was not smiling. My entire body went cold. I stepped backward immediately. The reflection slowly returned to normal. When I told Uncle Mark, he closed his eyes for several seconds. Then he quietly said, "That was another sign." It was trying to separate me from myself. The afternoon felt unusually warm. The lake was perfectly still again. Too still. I sat outside for a while, because staying inside the cabin was becoming unbearable. Then I heard somebody fishing nearby. I turned around expecting to see Uncle Mark. Instead, I saw myself sitting at the end of the dock. The other version of me was wearing the exact same clothes. It held the same fishing rod I owned. It looked peaceful. Then it slowly turned its head toward me. Its eyes were completely black. I blinked once and it disappeared. I almost convinced myself it was a hallucination. Then I noticed footprints leading away from the dock. My footprints. The exact same shoe pattern. They disappeared into the forest. I did not tell Uncle Mark right away. I was embarrassed. I was beginning to question my own sanity. But eventually I did tell him. He looked genuinely alarmed. He said that meant something had changed again. Until now, it had only been imitating voices. Now it was building bodies. That evening, he brought every notebook into the living room. We spent hours searching through entries. One sentence appeared repeatedly throughout different generations. It wants to replace the person it chooses. Nobody knew exactly what that meant, because nobody had ever recorded the final stage. Every notebook either ended abruptly or the person escaped before discovering more. Around sunset, Uncle Mark did something unusual. He wrote a new rule on another piece of paper and taped it beside the fireplace. Do not trust your own eyes after midnight. I stared at him. He said he should have added that years ago. Then darkness arrived. Almost immediately, the atmosphere changed. It was happening earlier every night now. At 8:30, we heard movement upstairs. Neither of us had gone upstairs since I arrived because the attic was mostly used for storage. The footsteps continued for several minutes. Then they stopped directly above us. We remained silent. Then something heavy dragged across the floor, slowly. Then it stopped. A minute later, another sound appeared. Somebody was humming. It was my mother's song. The same melody she used to hum while cooking dinner. I felt tears immediately building in my eyes. Grief mixed with fear in a way that was difficult to describe. Then the humming stopped. At 10, every light in the cabin flickered once, then again. Then they stabilized. Nothing else happened for almost an hour. That made me nervous because there was usually some escalation. Midnight arrived quietly, too quietly. Then I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around automatically before remembering the new rule. My heart stopped. I was looking directly at myself. The other version of me was standing in the hallway. It stared back at me with a blank expression. Every detail was perfect. Same face, same posture, same exhaustion beneath the eyes. Then it spoke. You can rest now. I immediately looked away. Uncle Mark grabbed my arm. Do not engage with it. The other version of me slowly walked into the living room. I could hear its footsteps approaching. Then it sat in the extra chair that had appeared the previous night. Neither of us looked at it directly. Then it spoke again. Uncle Mark is lying to you. I felt my chest tighten. Then it continued. The cabin is not keeping it inside. The cabin is feeding it. Uncle Mark remained silent. Then my duplicate laughed softly. It already lives inside him. That sentence hit me harder than anything else. I looked at Uncle Mark instinctively. He was staring at the fireplace. Then the duplicate stood up. I could hear its footsteps circling me. Then it stopped beside my chair. It leaned close enough for me to hear its breathing. Then it whispered, "Ask him why he never left." My entire body froze. I slowly turned toward Uncle Mark. He still refused to look at me. The duplicate laughed again. Then suddenly the front door burst open by itself. Cold air flooded inside. The duplicate vanished instantly. Then we heard it. Hundreds of footsteps in the forest. Not one creature. Hundreds. They surrounded the cabin from every direction. Then every voice we had ever heard began speaking at once. My mother, My own voice. Uncle Mark. The child. The old woman from town. Dozens of strangers. They all repeated one sentence. Tonight it chooses. We sat there unable to move, while the voices echoed through the darkness. Then beside me, Uncle Mark finally said something that terrified me more than anything outside. He said he had not been staying at the cabin to protect the family. He had been staying because if he ever left, whatever was here would follow him. And he was beginning to fear that it had finally found a way to do exactly that through me. I barely slept after that confession. In fact, I do not think sleep was even possible anymore. My body would occasionally shut down for 10 or 15 minutes, but my brain never truly rested. Every sound immediately woke me up. Every silence felt dangerous. By sunrise, I felt like a completely different person than the man who arrived at this cabin looking for a peaceful vacation. I walked outside early that morning. The air was cold. The lake was perfectly still again. I stared at my reflection in the water. For a moment, everything looked normal. Then, my reflection blinked. I had not blinked yet. I immediately stepped backward. The image returned to normal. I was starting to understand something terrifying. It was no longer waiting for night. It was everywhere now. Uncle Mark joined me outside carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He looked exhausted, worse than ever before. There was a heaviness in his movements that I had never noticed before, almost like he was carrying a burden that had finally become too heavy. We sat in silence for several minutes. Then he told me something he had hidden from everyone. 20 years ago, he had already been chosen once. I stared at him. He nodded slowly. Apparently he survived because he made a deal. Not a supernatural ritual or anything dramatic. Just a decision. He agreed to stay at the cabin permanently. In exchange, the thing never followed him beyond the property line. It never harmed anyone else. At least that was what he believed. But now things were changing. I asked why. He looked directly at me. Because you came here willingly. That answer confused me at first. Then he explained. Nobody in our family had willingly returned after being warned. My mother left forever. My grandfather avoided this place. Everyone else stayed away. But I came here by choice. Somehow that mattered. It was almost like an invitation. Around noon, we decided to search the area around the lake. We had avoided going too far into the woods since all of this started. But Uncle Mark thought there might be answers somewhere. We carried flashlights even though it was daytime. We walked carefully along an old trail. The deeper we went, the stranger everything felt. The trees were taller than I remembered. The air felt heavier. Even sounds seemed muted. Then we found something. A circle of old stones hidden beneath moss. In the center sat an empty wooden chair. My stomach immediately tightened, because it looked exactly like the extra chair that had appeared in the cabin. Uncle Mark stared at it for a long time. Then he said he had never seen it before. We approached carefully. There were names carved into the chair. My great-grandfather, my grandfather, my mother, then my name. The carving looked fresh. I touched it. The wood was cold, too cold. Then I heard breathing behind us. We both turned around. Nothing was there. Then dozens of voices whispered from every direction. Go home. The words echoed between the trees. We immediately returned to the cabin. Something had changed again. It was no longer hiding clues. It was leading us somewhere. That realization terrified both of us. The rest of the afternoon passed with growing anxiety. Then I noticed something strange about Uncle Mark. He kept forgetting things. He forgot where he put his coffee mug. He forgot whether he had eaten lunch. Then he forgot the date. I asked if he was feeling okay. He stared at me for a moment before answering. His expression looked confused. Then he said something that chilled me. "It is taking memories now." Around sunset, we prepared for another night. But there was a sense of finality in the air. Neither of us said it out loud, but we both felt it. Something big was coming. We checked every window. We kept the back door open. We lit every lamp in the cabin. Then darkness arrived. The forest immediately became active. We could hear movement everywhere. Not footsteps this time. Whispers. Thousands of whispers. They surrounded the cabin from every direction. At 9, the lights dimmed, then returned, then dimmed again. At 10, every notebook in the cabin suddenly fell off the shelves at once. Pages scattered everywhere. I picked one up. The writing had changed. Every notebook now contained the same sentence repeated over and over. "There is only room for one." My heart immediately began racing. Then the clock struck midnight. Every sound outside stopped. Absolute silence covered the world. Then somebody knocked 3 times. Caught, caught, caught. We did not move. Then the front porch creaked. Somebody was standing there. Then another person joined them. Then another. Then another. We heard dozens of people gathering outside. Then they all spoke simultaneously. "Open the door." We remained silent. Then I heard my mother's voice again. But this time it sounded different. Sadder somehow. "Daniel, do not believe everything it shows you." My eyes widened. Then another voice immediately interrupted her. It was my own voice. "She is lying." Then another voice appeared. Uncle Mark's voice. "Open the door before it is too late." Then all the voices blended together. They became impossible to separate. The entire cabin vibrated. Suddenly every mirror inside the house shattered at once. Glass exploded everywhere. Then complete silence returned. A few seconds later, I heard footsteps upstairs. Heavy footsteps. They slowly walked toward the attic door. Then they stopped. Then somebody began descending the stairs. One step at a time. Slow. Deliberate. I could hear wood creaking beneath each footstep. Eventually, whoever it was reached the bottom. Then it walked into the hallway. Neither of us looked. Then it stopped beside me. I felt its presence. Then it whispered directly into my ear. "Which one of you is real?" My entire body froze. Then I looked at Uncle Mark. He looked terrified too. Then something impossible happened. Another Uncle Mark walked into the room. He looked exactly the same. Same clothes. Same expression. Then another version entered behind him. Then another. Within seconds there were 4 Uncle Marks standing in the room, all identical. All staring at me. Then each one spoke. "I am the real one." I could not breathe. My heart was pounding uncontrollably. Then another version of me entered the room too. Then another. Then another. Suddenly there were copies of both of us everywhere. The cabin felt crowded. Every version stared directly at me. Then all of them smiled at the same time. Except one. One version of my mother was standing quietly in the hallway. She did not smile. She simply pointed toward the back door. Then she disappeared. I immediately understood one thing. Whatever happened next would decide everything. Because for the first time since arriving at this cabin, I was no longer afraid of dying. I was terrified of surviving as the wrong version of myself. For several seconds I could not move at all. Every instinct was telling me to panic, but my body felt strangely calm. Maybe because I had reached a point where fear itself no longer worked on me. There were copies of Uncle Mark standing around the room. There were copies of me standing beside them. Every version looked perfect. Every detail was identical. Even their breathing sounded real. The only thing that felt different was the air itself. It felt heavier, thicker somehow, like reality inside the cabin was struggling to hold together. Then one version of Uncle Mark pointed toward the back door. Another pointed toward the front door. Another pointed toward the hallway. Each one was trying to direct my attention somewhere else. The copies of me simply stared at me. Their expressions were blank. Then one of them spoke. "If you choose wrong, you stay here forever." Another one smiled. Then another spoke. "If you choose right, you can finally go home." Every voice overlapped. My head immediately began hurting. I squeezed my eyes shut for a moment. Then I remembered something my doctor told me back in Toronto. When your mind is overwhelmed, focus on one thing that you know is real, just one thing. So I focused on my breathing. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. Then I noticed something. Every copy was speaking, except one. The real Uncle Mark had stopped talking entirely. He was staring at the floor. I remembered something else too. Throughout this entire experience, every imitation wanted my attention. It wanted me to engage with it. The real people never did. I slowly walked toward the silent Uncle Mark. Every copy immediately began shouting at once. "Wrong choice. Stop. Do not trust him. He is lying." The noise became unbearable, but I kept walking. Then I grabbed his arm. Immediately every duplicate vanished. The entire room became silent. It was only the two of us again. Uncle Mark exhaled heavily. Then he nodded once. That was the first test. The first test. Hearing those words made my stomach sink. There were more. We sat down immediately because both of us were exhausted. Uncle Mark looked more frightened than ever. He admitted something that he had hidden all this time. The notebooks were incomplete because nobody ever recorded the final night. Every chosen person either disappeared or survived without remembering exactly what happened. Tonight would probably be that final night. I asked him how he knew. He pointed toward the wall. There were marks beside the fireplace that I had never noticed before. Short vertical lines carved into the wood. He counted them. 9 nights. Tonight was the 10th. Every chosen person apparently reached 10 nights. Never 11. The realization hit me immediately. Tomorrow would be the last day one way or another. The entire day passed under a cloud of anxiety. We barely spoke. Every task felt meaningless. We cleaned dishes that did not need cleaning. We organized firewood we would probably never use. We sat quietly beside the lake for almost an hour. Then something happened that neither of us expected. My phone vibrated. I immediately froze. I had not had service since arriving. Yet there it was. 187 missed messages, 40 emails, several calls from work. My heart immediately sank. Then another feeling followed. Temptation. It was my old life reaching back toward me. I opened one message, then another. My manager was asking where I was. Clients needed reports. Deadlines were approaching. For a split second, all the horror around me faded. I almost forgot everything. I almost became that exhausted project manager again. Then Uncle Mark grabbed the phone from my hand and turned it off. He said that was how it worked. It wanted people to return to whatever had broken them before arriving here. My eyes widened. Suddenly everything made sense. I had not been chosen randomly. I had arrived empty, burned out, exhausted, vulnerable. Maybe every person before me had been the same way. The thing did not hunt healthy people. It hunted people who had already begun disappearing inside themselves. That realization hit me harder than any ghost or voice ever had. The sun eventually began to set. Both of us prepared carefully for what we believed would be the final night. We closed every window. We opened the back door. We lit every lamp. Then darkness arrived. Immediately the forest began humming. Not voices, not footsteps, a low hum. Thousands of sounds blending together. Around 8, every photograph in the cabin fell off the walls. I picked one up. My mother's face was gone. Every image of her had vanished. Then another photograph. My face was gone too. Then another. Every member of my family had disappeared from every picture except Uncle Mark. He sat quietly staring at them. Then he said something softly. "It is making room." Around 10, we heard movement upstairs again. But this time it was different. Somebody was carrying furniture. We heard chairs scraping across the floor, heavy footsteps, then laughter. Dozens of people laughing, then complete silence. Midnight arrived. Every light in the cabin went out at once. The fireplace died immediately. Darkness swallowed everything. Then I heard breathing right in front of me. Then another breath behind me. Then another beside me. The entire room was full. I could not see them, but they were there. Then a voice spoke, my own voice. "It is time to choose." Suddenly every light returned. I looked around. The cabin was completely different. Every chair was occupied. My family was sitting there. My mother, my grandfather, my great-grandfather, people I had never met. Every generation, they all stared at me silently. Then one by one, their faces began changing. They became me. Every single one of them. Dozens of versions of myself filled the room. Then they all smiled at once. The real Uncle Mark grabbed my shoulder. Then he said something that finally made everything click into place. There was never one creature. It was every version of every person who surrendered to it over generations. It was an accumulation, a growing memory that never stopped expanding. It did not kill people. It absorbed them. Then suddenly every version of me stood up at once and pointed toward the back door. Outside, standing beside the lake, was another version of me waiting in complete silence. And somehow, deep inside my chest, I knew that if he entered the cabin before sunrise, there would never be a real Daniel left to return home. I do not know how long I stared at the figure beside the lake. It felt like minutes, but it could have been seconds. He looked exactly like me. There was no distortion anymore. No black eyes. No strange smile. He simply stood there wearing my clothes and looking back at the cabin. That somehow made him even more terrifying. He looked normal. Then he took one step forward. Every version of me inside the cabin immediately turned their heads toward him. Nobody moved after that. Nobody spoke either. The entire world felt suspended. Then Uncle Mark grabbed my arm hard enough to pull me out of my trance. He told me to listen carefully, because we only had one chance. He said, my mother had figured something out before she left decades ago. The thing could imitate people. It could absorb people, but it could not create anything original. That was its weakness. Every single thing it knew came from us. Every fear, every memory, every voice, every desire. It was an enormous collection of borrowed pieces. Nothing inside it truly belonged to itself. I asked him what that meant. He pointed toward my chest. It does not know who you are if you stop being who it expects. I did not understand at first. Then another version of me outside took another step toward the cabin. He was closer now. Uncle Mark spoke quickly. It expects exhaustion. It expects fear. It expects the old version of you. The man who arrived here was already disappearing long before he reached this place. Those words hit me harder than anything supernatural had. He was right. For years, I had become somebody I barely recognized. My entire life had turned into deadlines and emails. I had stopped seeing friends. I had stopped living. Maybe that was why this thing attached itself to me so easily. It did not have to create an empty space. The empty space was already there. Then another thought suddenly entered my mind. My mother escaped because she refused to become the person it expected. I looked at Uncle Mark. He nodded immediately. That was exactly what she did. She left her old life behind. She changed everything. She stopped feeding it pieces of herself. Outside, my duplicate took another step. Then another. He was halfway to the cabin now. The versions inside the cabin began whispering. Hundreds of voices layered together. Stay tired. Stay afraid. Stay broken. Their words echoed throughout the room. Then I realized something. They were not threats. They were instructions. They needed me to remain the same person who arrived here. Then my duplicate outside spoke for the first time. He said something in my own voice that almost shattered my concentration. He said that none of this was real and that I was suffering a mental breakdown. My chest tightened instantly because that was exactly what I wanted to believe at the beginning. Then he spoke again. Return to Toronto. Go back to work. Everything will be normal again. For a split second, I almost listened. Then, I remembered how miserable I had been before arriving. I remembered standing outside my apartment, unable to remember where I put my keys. I remembered eating protein bars for dinner because I was too exhausted to cook. I remembered loneliness disguised as productivity. Suddenly I became angry. Truly angry. Not at the thing outside. At myself. I had spent years allowing life to slowly erase me. This place simply exposed what was already happening. I stood up. Every version inside the cabin immediately stood too. Then I spoke out loud for the first time in hours. I said I was done being that person. The cabin suddenly shook. Every light flickered violently. Outside, my duplicate stopped walking. Then he frowned. That was the first genuine emotion I had ever seen from him. Then every version inside the cabin began shouting at once. Their voices became frantic. They repeated old memories, deadlines, missed calls, regrets, failures, every insecurity I had ever carried. But instead of overwhelming me, they sounded pathetic, repetitive, like a recording playing on a loop. Then something incredible happened. Their voices started disappearing one by one. The copies began fading around the edges. Uncle Mark grabbed my shoulder and told me to keep going. So I did. I spoke every truth I had ignored for years. I admitted I was exhausted. I admitted I was lonely. I admitted I had built a life that was slowly destroying me. I admitted I deserved better than surviving from one deadline to another. Every sentence made the cabin shake harder. The duplicate outside suddenly stopped moving entirely. Then cracks appeared across his body like fractures in glass. The whispers grew weaker. Then my mother's voice appeared one last time. Unlike before, it sounded warm. Real. She told me to go home. Then she said she was proud of me. Tears immediately filled my eyes. Then everything exploded into noise. The lights shattered. Wind roared through the cabin. Every notebook flew into the air. The voices screamed all at once. Then suddenly silence arrived. Complete silence. I opened my eyes. Morning sunlight was pouring through the windows. I was lying on the living room floor. Uncle Mark was sitting beside me. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Eventually he smiled for the first time since I arrived. A real smile. Then he said it was over. I looked outside. The forest looked normal again. The lake was peaceful. The heaviness was gone. We spent the rest of the day cleaning the cabin in complete silence. There was no dramatic ending. No monster body. No ancient secret hidden underground. Just quiet. That was enough. 2 days later, I packed my car and prepared to leave. Before I drove away, Uncle Mark handed me my mother's notebook. He told me to keep it. Then, he said something that has stayed with me ever since. Some places do not create monsters. They reveal them. I hugged him goodbye and drove south. The farther I got from the cabin, the lighter I felt. Months have passed since then. I quit my old job. I found another position with reasonable hours. I started seeing friends again. I answer fewer emails. I take vacations now. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night. Sometimes I still check the windows before bed. Old habits do not disappear overnight. But one thing never returned. Nobody calls my name from outside anymore. Last week, I opened my mother's notebook one final time before placing it on a bookshelf. There was one new sentence written at the end. I know it was not there before. The handwriting belonged to my mother. It said that the forest only keeps people who were already lost. Then underneath that sentence was another line written in blue ink. This one was new. It simply said that Daniel finally found his way home.